Carlos Newton. If you were watching MMA in the late 1990s and early 2000s, you knew this name. Carlos Newton, nicknamed the Ronin, Canadian fighter out of Winnipeg, who brought something the sport had never really seen before. Pure, beautiful, technical grappling combined with a striking game that could actually compete at the highest level. Think about the context. This was the early UFC era. There were brawlers, there were pure grapplers, there were strikers who couldn't take a shot, but Newton was doing something different. He was flowing. He was creative on the mat. He wasn't just shooting for takedowns and holding people down. He was hunting for submissions from everywhere, transitioning between positions like water. He had a judo-influenced style that felt almost artistic compared to the raw chaos happening around him. In 2001, he captured the UFC welterweight championship by finishing Pat Miletich, one of the most respected fighters and coaches in early MMA history. That title win alone cemented his legacy. But what made Newton truly special was what he represented. The idea that technical skill, creativity, and well-rounded ability could beat raw aggression and physical dominance. In a sport that was still figuring itself out, Carlos Newton showed what a complete fighter could look like. He's been largely forgotten. He shouldn't be. If you're enjoying this so far, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow and gets this kind of content in front of more fans who love the history of this sport. It takes 2 seconds and means everything. Pedro Rizzo, the Brazilian bomber. There is a version of early MMA history where Pedro Rizzo is considered one of the greatest heavyweights who ever lived. And that version isn't wrong. Rizzo was a Brazilian striker, trained in boxing and Muay Thai, who brought a level of technical striking to the heavyweight division that simply did not exist in the late 1990s. Most heavyweights at that time were big, strong, and threw hard shots. Rizzo did something different. He was precise, disciplined, and devastating. His leg kicks? Absolutely legendary. He would chop down opponents methodically, break their base, slow them down, and then finish them. He fought Randy Couture twice for the UFC heavyweight title. Both fights went to decision. Both fights were razor thin. Many observers felt Rizzo deserved the win in at least one, possibly both of those fights. He also had wins over Josh Barnett, Tank Abbott, Andrei Arlovsky, and Dan Severn, fighters who defined that heavyweight era. Pedro Rizzo never got that championship, and because MMA history often remembers champions above all else, his name slowly faded. But talk to fighters who were around back then. Talk to coaches. They'll tell you. Rizzo was one of the most technically gifted heavyweights of his generation. The sport passed him by. History almost did too. Not on this channel. Evan Tanner, the soul of a champion. This one is different. Every sport has its warriors, its technicians, its knockout artists. But every so often, a story comes along that's less about what happened inside the cage and more about what the fighter represented as a human being. Evan Tanner is that story. Tanner was the UFC middleweight champion in 2005, defeating David Loiseau to claim the title. But the way he got there and the journey his life represented is what made him a legend in the truest sense of the word. He was self-taught. He studied technique from books and videos at a time when MMA gyms were rare and training resources were almost non-existent. He was a journeyman in the earliest days of his career, losing fights, learning, rebuilding, and coming back. He wrote openly about his struggles, his demons, the fact that finding purpose through fighting kept him grounded when life was pulling him in darker directions. And in 2008, at 37 years old, Evan Tanner went on a solo camping trip in the California desert. He never came home. His passing shocked the MMA community, and it reminded everyone who had followed his journey that behind every fighter is a full human life, with all the complexity, struggle, and beauty that comes with it. Evan Tanner was a champion, but more than that, he was real. In a sport built on toughness, he showed a different kind of courage. Ricardo Arona, the Pride Nightmare. In the Pride light heavyweight division during the early to mid-2000s, there was one name that gave almost every top fighter serious problems: Ricardo Arona, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt and elite wrestler from the Shootbox Academy. Arona was a nightmare on the ground. Not just good, a genuine, consistent nightmare. His top pressure was suffocating. Once he got a takedown, and he got a lot of takedowns, the fight changed completely. He would grind, he would control, he would hunt for submissions, or simply dominate from dominant positions until the fight was over. He went 11-1 in Pride. That one loss? Against Wanderlei Silva Silva, one of the most feared strikers in MMA history, in a fight where Arona was genuinely winning before a devastating late stoppage. He beat Dan Henderson. He beat Quinton Rampage Jackson. He had a win over Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. These are Hall of Famers, all-time greats, and Arona beat them. His problem, if you can call elite-level world-class grappling a problem, was that his style wasn't always crowd-pleasing. He controlled fights more than he finished them, and in an era that rewarded violence and finishes, a grappling-dominant style sometimes got overlooked. But make no mistake, Ricardo Arona was elite. In the most competitive light heavyweight era in MMA history, he was one of the very best. History hasn't been kind enough to his name. Today, we correct that. Frank Shamrock, the first modern fighter. If you had to point to the moment when MMA stopped being about what style is best and started being about who could do everything, fight everywhere, stand up, take it down, submit, or get up, you might point to Frank Shamrock. Not Ken Shamrock, his famous brother. Frank Shamrock was the UFC middleweight champion from 1997 to 1999, and in that period he was arguably the most complete fighter on the planet. He had submission grappling from the Lion's Den, he had striking that could compete. He had conditioning that was ahead of its time. Fighters from that era talk about how physically prepared he was compared to everyone else. He submitted Kevin Jackson, who was an Olympic gold medalist in wrestling, in 16 seconds. He stopped Boss Rutten, one of the most dangerous strikers in MMA, in one of the most competitive championship fights of that period. He vacated his title undefeated and moved on. Some saw that as a mistake. Others saw it as a fighter who had simply conquered everything in front of him and didn't need the belt to prove his worth. Frank Shamrock understood something that most fighters of his time didn't, that the future of MMA belonged to athletes who could fight everywhere, who had no glaring holes, who could dictate where and how a fight happened. He was the prototype. Before we had a name for what a modern mixed martial artist looked like, Frank Shamrock was showing us. Pat Miletich. We've talked about fighters who changed the sport inside the cage, but this last legend changed it in a way that might be even more significant because his impact didn't end when his fighting career did. Pat Miletich. From Bettendorf, Iowa, a place not exactly known as a combat sports capital, Miletich built something extraordinary. The Miletich Fighting Systems Team, one of the first truly professional MMA training camps in the world. As a fighter, he was the UFC welterweight champion for over 2 years, one of the longest title reigns of that era. He defended against multiple challenges. He was a genuine world-class competitor. But his team? His team produced champions in multiple weight classes. Jens Pulver, Tim Sylvia, Robbie Lawler, Matt Hughes, who became one of the greatest welterweights of all time. What Miletich understood was that the future of MMA wasn't individual fighters figuring it out alone. It was organized, disciplined, professional training camps with real structure and real coaching. He was building that before almost anyone else, and the champions he produced speak for themselves. Pat Miletich gave us a blueprint. If you want to develop elite MMA fighters, build a team, build a culture, build something that outlasts any single fight. He did exactly that, and the sport is better for it. Before the conclusion, if you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of fan we make this content for. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment below. Which of these 10 fighters do you think deserves a full, dedicated video? Let us know. We read every single comment. Conclusion: 10 fighters, 10 stories. Carlos Newton, Pedro Rizzo, Evan Tanner, Heath Herring, Yuki Nakai, Murilo Bustamante, Vitor Belfort, Ricardo Arona, Frank Shamrock, Pat Miletich. These men competed when MMA was still finding its identity, when the rules were incomplete, when the sport was one bad night on Capitol Hill away from being banned everywhere, when fighters were paid almost nothing and asked to risk almost everything. They didn't do it for the money. Most of them didn't do it for the fame. They did it because they loved fighting, because they believed in what this sport could become, and because somewhere inside them there was something that needed to be tested, needed to find out how they would respond when everything was on the line, and they responded. The sport we love today, with its global audiences, its legendary champions, its technically elite athletes, It exists because fighters like these ones came before. They built the foundation. They absorbed the failures, the setbacks, the physical cost. They deserved better recognition than they got, but maybe that's what makes their stories worth telling. If you made it to the end, thank you. Genuine. Share this video with someone who loves MMA history. Leave a comment. And if you're not subscribed, do it now. There's a lot more where this came from. We'll see you in the next one.